Today, I'll be speaking with Joelle Maletis, who will be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma and how we can move forward with it. Let me introduce her before I bring her on. Joelle Maletis is a licensed marriage and family therapist who incorporates CBT and DBT skills, somatic work, and EMDR, along with talk therapy and solution-focused therapy to provide a structure that allows clients to make changes in their own lives. By offering a safe space, Joelle works with a diverse clientele that includes C-suite executives, content moderators, active and retired military personnel, first responders, police and law enforcement, and those experiencing various forms of trauma, PTSD, and post-traumatic growth. Joelle has appeared in several TED Talks as well as ABC's 60 Minutes Behind the Headlines. Joelle is also a published author among her many other accomplishments. Hi, Joelle. Thank you so much for being here and having this conversation about trauma with me today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be part of your podcast.
I just shared a little bit about your background, your very impressive background. But what struck me, I mean, you're definitely well-trained in the field of trauma and all the work you've done. But what struck me was your work with first responders, police officers, the military. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about your background and your training, and then how did you get involved working with that population? And then how do you normalize the stigma that surrounds that community?
Yeah, it's such good questions. And I love this question because I never have the same answer. You know, it's a really interesting topic. And really, I come from an Army family, and my dad was in military school, and I had family that served. I am a true civilian, and so I never pretend that I know what it's like to be in the military. But I really wasn't necessarily interested in working with military and first responders. I was really working with trauma, PTSD, and my dissertation was broad spectrum eating disorders, trauma, and what that looked like. And I fell into working with military and working with trauma and just ended up loving it. And it was this group of people that made sense to me. And after I started working with military, I started working with first responders and law enforcement. And in California, I'm one of actually very few that's a true civilian. And I work with special operations and special forces teams, which is also unique. And then I train for police departments, San Francisco, San Jose, and also for a couple of different military installations. So, you know, I love this group of people. It's been harder and harder. And I think this last year in particular, it's hard to walk, I think, this cultural line between having a job that isn't popular, having a lot of stigma around mental health, and then also having jobs that really are very quickly changing and need to change. And so people are just in this crossroads between who they've been and who they want to be, and how that actually fits into, you know, working on their own mental health and their own trauma.
The work that you're doing is really, really powerful, because there are a lot of first responders, military, police officers that are dealing with trauma. But like I said, with the stigma, I know a lot of them are not seeking help. They don't feel comfortable seeking help. There's also maybe some negative pushback against seeking help. Can you speak to the police officers, the first responders, the military personnel, and how to actually make it okay to seek help, and then breaking that stigma to make it to normalize therapy and getting help for the trauma that they're dealing with, because they see a lot of horrible things and they experience a lot of things, but then they feel like they can't talk to anybody about that. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I always start this question backwards, and you know, it really is finding the right person. You know, there's a lot of different modalities that work for therapy, and it's finding somebody who you feel like you can trust and interview that person. And if you don't like them, find somebody else. I mean, there's a lot of amazing therapists out there, and there's a lot of crummy ones too, just like any other profession. And so I think it starts there with, you know, who do I talk to, and can I actually talk to that person? Do they have experience with, you know, paramilitary, first responders, law enforcement, military, or not? Are they familiar with trauma and post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic stress disorder? So do a little interviewing. You know, I think that's the first thing. The second thing I always say is find out what that therapist documents. And the reason I say that is that's one of the biggest fears is, what are they writing down about me? You know, is this going into my medical record? Is my boss going to find out? And based on what state you live in, you know, ask that person, what are the confidentiality guidelines? And can I tell you things in complete confidence? So in California, we have very strict guidelines, and it really is, the client comes in, especially when they're self-referred, they're choosing to come to therapy, they come in and I can't talk to anybody without their implicit written permission. And so that helps too, explaining the process of, look, it really is confidential. You can come in, you can tell me all sorts of things, and I can't tell your boss, I can't tell your partner, I can't tell anyone. You know, there's a few exceptions to those rules, right? When you're a danger to yourself or others. We have adult reporting, APS reporting, or child CPS reporting, you know, but those are sort of these extraneous, I think, examples. For most people, they just want to know they can come in and be confidential. So I think that's a piece of it. And then this idea of stigma, am I weak? You know, I should be able to handle it, should be able to handle it. And I think so many people that are in law enforcement, our first responders, our military, you know, this population of people who sees traumatic things on a daily basis feel like they're broken. I hear that word a lot. I'm broken because I have to go to therapy, instead of looking at it as if, well, you go to the doctor and you have a physical once a year, you know, why not talk to a therapist or psychologist about how you're handling all the trauma and the stress? It may not be something that's affecting your daily life and living. And there may be other things that affect you all the time. You don't sleep as well, and talking about it with somebody would be helpful to learn some skills. And so it can be as simple as that. I think we want to put this, you know, big I illness into it, and we meaning the general population. And so it makes it difficult to seek therapy.
Yeah, and I like what you said. It's not about giving up on therapy, because if you go to one bad therapist, that doesn't mean therapy is not helpful. Don't give up on therapy. That's what I always tell people. Don't give up on therapy. I mean, even I might not be a good match for them. And then I encourage them to go find somebody that they feel more comfortable with, because it's so important to find somebody that can listen to you. And like you said, keep the information confidential so that they can feel comfortable seeking the help that they need. And I really agree with that.
Yeah, and I would say it's the same thing with treatment models too. You know, a lot of times people say, well, I tried this thing, you know, I tried talk therapy, and all that person did was just write notes on a clipboard and they didn't say anything, and I don't like that. And it's like, well, that's one model. It works really well for some people, right? Doesn't work for other people. And then there are other models, which is all skills based. You know, do this thing, A plus B equals C. Do this thing and let me know if that helps you. And I have plenty of clients that say, I don't want to read, I don't want to do homework, don't assign me anything to do, I just want to talk to you, right? And then I have other clients that want the workbook, right? So I think that's another piece is, I always tell new clients, try it with me 2 or 3 times. If I'm not the right fit, tell me. You're not hurting my feelings. I will find you somebody great. I'll find you somebody great. There's so many great modalities. There's so many great therapists. I am not the best fit for everyone, right? So
I agree with that. And it's like you said, there are so many different modalities, but also one thing for a lot of people, especially dealing with trauma, to keep in mind is there is, I guess, a side effect of therapy where it'll get really difficult. It'll be really hard to deal with the trauma, and it'll be hard to go through that journey, but you'll be so much better on the other end once you go through it. I'm a firm believer of you have to feel it to heal it, and feeling it might not feel good to go through all of that. So giving it a chance, trying the sessions, asking for help during the difficult times, because it's not always going to be enjoyable. You're not always going to feel good after talking about it. You're not always going to feel good after journaling. So just understand that that's part of the process, but that's also part of the healing.
yeah, I mean, therapy is not fun. I mean, you know, I feel, even when I go to therapy, you know, there are times where I feel like I just like spilled my guts out on the floor. My therapist just stomped all over them and handed it back to me after 50 minutes and said, okay, see you in a few weeks, right? It doesn't feel good. I definitely can say that I feel lighter. right? And so there's a part of that processing, even if I'm complaining about my adult children and that's the therapy for the week, or I'm processing my own trauma, right? It's these huge swings. And I think that's, like you said, part of the process is the more we trust the process, the more vulnerable we're willing to be. And that healing does start, and it does work. It just doesn't feel great. I think that's such an important distinction.
At least initially, but you will feel so much better once you go through it. So don't give up on the therapy and just keep trying.
Yeah, absolutely. And things shift and change in ways that we don't predict. And in some ways that's exciting, and who I am in a few weeks is going to be different than who I am in a few months. And watching that shift in how we process trauma is important, I think.
Exactly. You also work in your intro. I mentioned that you work with C-suite executives and Silicon Valley professionals. And so a lot of type A, achievement oriented, goal getters. So is there a connection to trauma and perfectionism or overachieving? Have you noticed that in your work with that population?
Yeah, that's it's such an interesting question. And I'm not a researcher, and so I don't have, good numbers for you to say, well, it's X percentage of this or that. There is definitely connections. And so perfectionism and good stress versus perfectionism and what they would say bad stress, right? Perfectionism and trauma. There's an absolute correlation between perfectionism and eating disorders, perfectionism and anxiety. We know that people who have mental health issues or they have mental health diagnoses sometimes also have perfectionism. So there's this downside to it. The plus side is that it also drives people to achieve, like you said, that type A personality, and this workaholic, or all sorts of different, there's all sorts of different isms, right, that we attach to it. So perfectionism falls into that category. I think with trauma, that's a really interesting question. If someone has trauma in their background, sometimes the reason that they are so successful and they are perfectionists is that's the coping mechanism, right? That's their ability to continue to achieve and go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And as long as I keep busy, right, I don't have to feel it, or I don't have to deal with it. And so I just continue to push it off to the side and go on to the next thing and achieve even more, right? So it's one way to cope. And so, if we could say it may be a healthy coping strategy, depending on what the scenario is. So there's absolutely a link. I don't think that that's a true statement for everybody, though.
No, definitely. You mentioned that. I mean, you kind of touched on it, and that a lot of people that are perfectionistic or overachieving or workaholics are really avoiding deep-seated issues that they don't want to touch. And so the more they avoid it, they hope that it'll go away. But one thing that I've learned when it comes to trauma is it never goes away if you don't process it. I actually had a patient. She was 82 years old, and finally, I mean, she was starting to have nightmares of being molested by her dad at the age of 19, or not molested, or raped at that point, but at the age of 19. And she's 82 years old, and she did everything she could to move past that trauma and push it aside, don't think about it, married all the wrong men, did everything she could. And finally at 82, she's like, I think I'm ready to finally deal with it. And it was very difficult. But that's the thing with trauma. It doesn't store in our body the same way that memories do. And so can you speak a little bit about trauma, the different types of trauma, and then how can people distinguish what they're going through? Like you said, post-traumatic stress disorder versus post-traumatic stress. Can you speak a little bit about that? And then we can go on into the treatment modalities afterwards.
Yeah. So, we in the world of psychology, like pre 2014, used to say there's this thing of big T trauma and little t trauma, and that was the difference of something that happened to me versus something that I witnessed. With research, and we know that that's not the case anymore. And so really for me as a clinician, I say, look, if it's traumatic to you, then it's trauma. It doesn't have to be traumatic to me. right? If it's something that you feel is traumatic, then chances are it is traumatic. And like you said, our body holds that trauma in all different ways. Some people have, GI issues, autoimmune issues, definitely sleep, eating, exercise, romantic relationships, struggling at work. I mean, you name it, it runs the gamut of how trauma interrupts our daily life and living. And when we avoid it, just to go back to the perfectionism example, when we continue to avoid it, right, people will come in and they'll say, I have this raging headache or I have chronic pain. And the more we start to unpack that, we can start to figure out what the traumas were. Maybe they're early childhood traumas, and maybe it's something that happened a year ago or even 6 months ago that they just didn't think they logged, right? It could be a horrific car accident that you see. I think watching the news in the last 6 months to a year, definitely has been traumatic for some. The pandemic has been traumatic for some. And so, we log all of that stuff and we may not process it or even be conscious of it, but our subconscious holds on to it and our body holds on to it. And so sometimes people will come in and they'll start unpacking how they feel. And I'm putting my hand on my chest, or I'm saying, I feel heavy or my chest hurts. I wonder if that's how you feel too when you're talking about this thing. So our body holds on to it, and we call that somatic, the way that we store somatic trauma. And so to answer your question, what's trauma? That's a hard one for me, because I really do believe that, if somebody's coming and saying, hey, this was traumatic, then that's true for them. The difference between what we would say post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is that D part represents daily life and living. So when something starts to interfere with your daily life and living, typically we look toward, okay, does that person meet criteria for PTSD? Is the symptoms that they're feeling deviant? And I don't mean deviant behavior, I mean disruptive. Does it continue to interrupt their ability to live life? With military and first responders, police officers, I would absolutely say therapists that work with trauma, some therapists in general, ER doctors, COVID nurses, right? People that are dealing with traumatic things day in and day out may not have the D disordered part, but they definitely have this secondary or vicarious trauma, this witnessed exposure that they hold on to, and it absolutely is traumatic. And so I think we're starting to look at trauma from a big umbrella instead of these two camps. Either you observed it or you lived it. And we're starting to understand that PTSD is not just a single episode, but it can be complex, where it could be childhood emotional abuse. There's a narcissistic parent, and growing up with a narcissistic parent for 17 or 18 years, is absolutely traumatic. And those incidents may be more complex. There may be more than just a one-time thing. So there's a lot of different ways that trauma is couched. And then how we work on it, like you said, that's the modality piece of it. And so I really do think that we are holistic in the sense of, we hold it in our body, we hold it in our mind. You talked about your patient who's all of a sudden having reoccurring memories and nightmares. The subconscious starts to unpack this. And it's part of why people don't want to come to therapy. They're terrified, right? And I use such a strong word of having to relive it and refeel it. And so a lot of times with the right clinician and a good match with therapy, that therapist can slow that process down so the person isn't feeling it all at once, right? It's a slower process, and it's not as painful, and it's manageable. So it interferes with our relationships and the way that we interact with each other. And so that's more of a cognitive based trauma, or the way the trauma would present. And I think when we talk about spirituality, some people will talk about this loss of faith, which we call moral injury. where especially veterans coming back will talk about, well, I thought it was this way and it ended up being that way, and how can humanity be so terrible? I think we saw that absolutely with the pandemic worldwide, and with our friends and loved ones, and how we hold that. So, I think we're starting to expand the way that we're looking at trauma and understanding trauma.
You're right. Trauma is very complicated. And the reason I share that story about my 82-year-old patient is a lot of people that go through trauma, they think they can just ignore it and stuff it, and it'll go away. And then they don't realize that it plays in the background and it affects every choice that they make. And it might actually lead them to choices or limit them in their choices that they're making, whether professionally or even in relationships. And so I would rather, knowing that if it's going to haunt me until I'm in my 80s and 90s, I would rather take the time to go through that painful experience, process it so that it's not continuing to affect me for the rest of my life. And then also what I find interesting when it comes to trauma is certain big traumas, like even this pandemic or being in a car accident or experiencing war, we're more likely to talk about it. And so it might not lead to that deep part. It might not lead to the disorder, right? Because we're talking about it, we're getting the support, we're getting the validation. But then some traumas, like you said, having a narcissistic parent or being abused or being shamed and humiliated as a child, we internalize that and we suffer in silence, and then we allow it to get bigger. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, those are such great points. Like you said, it's such a complicated web, right? And so sometimes when we talk about it, we talk about enough of the details where we're not holding on to it. Or I don't want to say it that way. We're not holding on to the whole thing, right? There's these outer layers that we're able to process through because we've talked about it, and there's bits and pieces of the experience that we may hold on to. Part of this is how each individual holds on to memories and what pieces of the memories, and it is the senses, it's sensory, right? So it could be, I hear a lot of times the smell of blood or the smell of somebody's cologne. It could be things taste, right? First responders and especially emergency service workers, the EMS, talk about blood has a certain metallic taste. And so things taste a certain way. They hear certain things. Fireworks, traditionally when we talk about veterans, we talk about fireworks. Fireworks sounds like gunshots, or it could sound like mortar rounds. So it's sensory. So we may store the sound of a certain event here and the smell from a certain event there and the visual representation of an even different event, that my attacker had a red jacket on, or it was a yellow 4-door blah 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 car, and so all of these bits and pieces get lumped together, and our subconscious, our dream state, starts to put all of those little pieces together and replay them. And that's the difference between having a memory or having a nightmare. In a nightmare, a lot of times the pieces are all of these little bits and pieces of things that we have stored in our memory that are traumatic. We just don't necessarily have language to it, or we haven't consciously remembered it. And so then we put it all together, and it comes out in our dreams. It comes out in the way that we engage, like you said, in relationships. It affects us all the time without us even knowing it, because we have this predisposition now where we're tuning into these little bits and pieces, and we become more and more hypervigilant, or more and more on edge and guarded, because we're used to things happening. We're used to seeing that yellow car, and whether we realize it or not, every time we see a yellow car, we may tense up a little bit, right? And that's just an example. So we start to respond, even subconsciously respond to our stimuli and what's going on in the environment without us even being aware of it. So I'll give you a perfect example, right? If you've ever been at a stoplight, and here you are at the steering wheel, and you're looking in your rearview mirror and you're watching this person come up behind you really quickly, and it doesn't matter if you've been rear-ended in a car accident before or if you've seen it on TV, automatically we go like this, right? We clench the steering wheel, our whole body tenses up, probably start to hold our breath, our jaw, right, tightens up, and we have about 30 different stress hormones that dump. Most of it is adrenaline and cortisol. So our adrenaline goes crazy, our cortisol goes crazy, and that one experience, it takes up to 72 hours for all of those hormones to level out. So if that happens multiple times in a day, right, our cortisol, we're stressed, right? Our body is just holding on to this. So every time we get in the car and we're at the stoplight, we're holding on the steering wheel, we're looking in the rearview mirror, right? Every time we look in the rearview mirror and we see a car coming up, we're going to mimic and repeat the same response. We do this, even if we've never been hit before, right? And so we start to learn this traumatic response, right? And we have this behaviored response that doesn't necessarily come from anything other than maybe as a kid, I saw that happen, or I was in a car accident as a child, or I watched a movie where there was a scene that really scared me. I just didn't realize it. But now every time I get in the car and I'm at the stoplight, right, I start to become a little bit more hypervigilant, or I hold myself a little bit differently. So
And that's what a lot of people don't understand is the movies we're watching, the video games we're playing, vicarious traumatization is a very real thing. But going back to what I was saying, as far as the big traumas, like if I was in a car accident or experienced war, I can talk about that because I was just a victim of it. But I can understand what the military personnel or even the police officers, it's part of the job, right? So it's almost like I shouldn't be reacting. I shouldn't be, this shouldn't affect me. This shouldn't cause me trauma. And so they're not given the same permission to talk about it like we would be. Like if I was in a situation, I would talk about it freely, like this is what happened to me. But what I'm finding is there's almost shame for military coming back saying, yeah, what I saw was awful and it continues to haunt me, but it was part of my job. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. You know, I think that, like you said, there's this permission structure of if I'm a victim of something, then there's support, right? And we understand that, and society is willing to provide plenty of resources and emotional resources and logistical resources for somebody, right? Versus this is my job. I signed up to do this thing. And yeah, I knew it was going to be pretty terrible, but it's okay. And I'm not supposed to have a reaction. And it's the I'm not supposed to piece, right? I'm not supposed to be reacting. And if I do react, what does that say about me? I'm weak. I'm incompetent. I'm unable to manage it. I can't handle it. I'm not very good at what I do. And so, yeah, it's held very differently. And again, this is really the distinction between post-traumatic stress versus disorder. And of course, things that are witnessed or experienced for people that have, like you said, first responders, police, military, who have these kinds of jobs, ER nurses, they're dealing with this day in and day out. And so there are things about their job that it really is just their job. And it is traumatic, and traumatic for the rest of us that don't do that job. For them, it may not be traumatic in the sense of disordered. It's traumatic stress, though. They keep bringing it on and bringing it on, and it layers and it builds. It's usually not a single episode. It's usually multiple episodes, and it's bits and pieces of multiple episodes. And so at the point that it becomes disordered, it's usually very complex trauma. It's not one thing, it's multiple things. And by the time that they want to talk about it, or they really need to talk about it, they're already having other symptoms. They can't sleep, they're going through a divorce, whatever it is, right? There's already big effects of not being able to process all of these little bits and pieces that are post-traumatic stress or trauma, you know, and trauma logged in a very different way than somebody who is a victim of a violent crime, which is also horrific, right? It's a different kind of a trauma.
Well, the good news is that there are a lot of treatment modalities that help people. The one I love is EMDR, and I also use tapping and encourage my patients to use it whenever they can, especially when they're in the middle of a situation that they can't really function. The tapping can really calm them down. But you would do EMDR and DBT. Can you speak a little bit about those two modalities for people that may want to try that and see if that can help them with their trauma?
Yeah, so DBT is this marrying between Western psychological thought or cognitive behavioral therapy and Eastern philosophy, mindfulness, and meditation, and it puts it all together. And part of what I love about DBT is it is skills based, and so there's a lot of, hey, try this thing. I'll give you a skill. And it works really well. A lot of times it's being in the body is so difficult when people have had sexual trauma, abuse of any kind, domestic violence. It's very hard to be in the body and they feel like they're floating or they feel numb. And so DBT is one of those things that helps people stay in their body and try and get grounded again. And so I love DBT for that reason, because it really is a holistic kind of approach, and it's logical. And so it makes sense to people, and it is accessible. It's easy to do when you practice, just like driving a car. It's a skill. The more you practice it, the easier it is to recall it and do. EMDR is a different kind of a technique, and it requires a very well-trained therapist to take somebody through that bilateral stimulation, which is processing on both sides of the brain. And sometimes people will use their finger. Sometimes they have, like you said, they have tapping. Other people have sound that they use, lights, or even light vibration. And it has to do with reprocessing trauma and bringing that out of the subconscious or out of the body, the somatic, and putting it into the conscious to be able to reintegrate. And that's done without talking about it. And so it's using somebody's ability to recall memory and bring that memory forward. And then having the stimulation helps reprocess that trauma and I guess desensitize it is the best way to say that. And the brain can then remember it in a different way. And we process trauma through nonverbal. It's a nonverbal technique in some ways. And so, those are two very different kinds of techniques.
What I love about the EMDR is that the patient doesn't have to rehash everything. It is nonverbal. They don't have to talk about it, but they do have to be comfortable enough to sit and feel it. I mean, I've tried it on a couple of people that were not able to relax at all, and I had to stop. I couldn't even get past the relaxation phase or the container phase. And it's like, this is not a good combination for you, because their body was so stiff, they were not able to relax enough to process that feeling. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But it is my favorite tool because you don't have to rehash all the details, but you do have to sit with it as you're feeling. Like I use the little light vibrations, the tappers that they hold in their hands, and be able to sit and feel it as the two sides of your brain are getting integrated. So that is one of the benefits of doing EMDR. I don't know too much about DBT, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it in a minute, but EMDR has been proven to be very effective for trauma as well as anxiety and some mental health issues as well. So but the DBT, I like the approach of mixing the Western and the Eastern philosophy. And you do say that it's a holistic approach. And I've mentioned, you had said something about the spoke analogy. Can you speak a little bit about that and the holistic aspect of DBT, the wheel and spoke?
Yeah. So, the way the metaphor that I use is we really are like a bicycle wheel. We have all these different spokes that make up who we are, our family, where we come from, what town we grew up in, how we identify, our relationships, so on and so forth, what we do for a living, and our traumas. And so those folks, they always bend, and some are more bent than others. When a few of them get broken, then the wheel doesn't function well or optimally. And that's really how I envision what trauma does. And what trauma looks like for people is it's not the whole person, it's a part of the person. And so, when you're looking at things that are again, EMDR is it's a great technique. It's a wonderful therapy to use. It doesn't work for everybody, and it works for a lot of different mental health issues and mental illnesses, and it's been proven to work. DBT is the same thing. It's now become one of the gold standards for therapy when we talk about skills-based therapy, different modality than EMDR. And it takes into consideration, all these different parts of us. And so there are skills for us to stop this ruminating or obsessive thinking that we get into sometimes, and we're going around and around and around on the same issue. DBT is one of those things where we can say, okay, stop, visualize a stop sign, take a breath. Okay, roll your shoulders back, take another breath. Okay, now, what's next? What do we do next? Can we switch gears? What can we do differently? Can we wash our face? Can we take a walk outside? Can we change gears? Can we read a book? Can we listen to a meditation? What can we do next to help us de-escalate from that anxiety or whatever is going on? So it's this whole approach that uses multiple different skills to try and get somebody back into themselves and grounded again to move forward, and to take that next step. The other thing I love about DBT is this concept of wise mind. And so if you think about that bicycle wheel, if you're watching the wheel go around and around and around, it's mesmerizing, right? And we can watch the wheel go around, and eventually we kind of calm down and we click into the cadence or the rhythm of that. And with this idea of wise mind, it's that observing. We kind of step off to the side and we go, all right, let me just watch myself go through this thing. And that's different than dissociating or numbing out or avoiding. It's really taking a step back and observing the whole thing and saying, okay, where do I need to react, or do I need to react? Can I take a breath, take a few seconds to figure out what I need to do next? And so it's this observer idea that's very, that's that Eastern philosophical meditation and mindfulness component of being grounded and just observing what's coming in and out of the mind without having a reaction to it.
That's really important, and it makes the person feel more empowered in dealing with their emotions, right?
Yeah, more in control. And especially when we put that with anxiety, or we put that with trauma, right? It feels so out of control, right? Mm-hmm. And people will say, I feel crazy. And a lot of times they say, I know it feels crazy, but you're not crazy, right? This is the body is reacting, the brain is reacting, and yeah, I get it. And the more out of control it feels, the harder we try and control it, right? Bring it back to us. And so that's that piece of when we start to observe it, we regain control, right? We can start to detach from it a little bit.
And that's the thing, or reducing that emotional charge it has over you so that you can create some emotional distance, so you can look at it in a way that it doesn't have that hold over you, like you said.
Yeah.
So do you have any last minute parting words about some suggestions and tips on if somebody is dealing with trauma or wanting to get help? What are some suggestions, some steps that you can recommend for them?
Yeah, there's so many resources out there, whether it's self-help books, workbooks. There are podcasts like yours. There's so many things. So that's an option. An option is if you have insurance, going to your insurance carrier's portal or website that has all of the providers listed and looking to see who are the providers in your network. That's an option. Doing a Google search with the word therapist in your zip code will bring you a whole host of people. Or you can put EMDR therapists with your zip code, or DBT therapists. So there's so many ways to find therapists. There's online or telehealth therapy now. So there are companies that are providing telehealth therapy that isn't too expensive. So there's lots of things. The other thing my sort of hidden gem is I'm actually in Silicon Valley, and so there's several psychology schools in the greater Bay Area, and several of them have their own clinics. And so seeing an intern or seeing a postdoc somebody who's a postdoc after graduation who's coming back to do an associateship, they're great. And sometimes that is low fee, sliding, scale fees, no fee therapy, if that's part of the concern, is the financial piece. And like I said in the very beginning, interviewing, ask the questions. Tell me do you see clients in person still? Is it only teletherapy? Are you only doing things over Zoom? How do you work? How do you work with this thing? Have you ever worked with police officers before? Ask the questions, and you'll know in the first few minutes if it feels like it's an okay fit or not.
Definitely. Those are some really good tips. And people might not want to go to an intern, but when I was an intern working with patients, I had a lot of support because I was also being guided by my supervisor. So I was giving them really good advice. It wasn't just on my experience. There are others. There's a whole bunch of people supporting me in helping my patients. So don't be afraid of going to an intern, because they also have the wisdom of their professors and their teachers and their supervisors to kind of help with that as well. It's not that they're sharing your information or that your confidentiality is at stake. They are just talking about the symptoms and how they can help you. So you're getting a team approach versus just one person.
Yeah. And I'm so blessed. I have such a great staff, and actually 2 people who've been with me, one, over 4 years and one just about 4 years. So through their entire postdoc, and are now getting ready to take their licensing exams. And so they've been trained with my method, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes it's the difference of being able to go to therapy, right? Or not being able to afford to go to therapy. I will say that to me, it is a luxury, because if nothing else, at the end of the day, I have a safe place I can go. I can say pretty much whatever I want to say about whomever I want to say it, right? And my therapist isn't going to judge me, and it's confidential, and I know that I can just vomit all of this emotional content out about sometimes absolutely nothing, and other times about very serious things. And I can go back the next week and sometimes pretend it didn't happen, and other times get called out that no, this thing did happen, now I have to deal with it, right? But I have these whole host of experiences, and then I get to leave. And my girlfriends, my friends, right, my family, my children, like, they are on my side all the time, and they get emotionally burned out. They don't want to hear me complain about this thing again, right? And I can go into my therapist and just give all of this to her. I don't feel guilty. She's being paid, right? And I feel better. I feel much lighter. And so therapy sometimes is a wonderful luxury, if nothing else, just to be able to have that space.
And that's what a lot of people don't understand. They're like, well, I have my friends and family to talk to, but they don't want to hear about the same problem over and over again. And also, it's unfair when you're talking to friends. There has to be some turn taking, right? Like, I'm going to talk about me, you talk a little bit about you, and I'm not going to hog the conversation for an hour. But in a therapist's office, you can take the entire hour and talk about anything you want, and they're going to listen to you. It's not about the therapist. And so it is a wonderful luxury. And I was talking about the side effect earlier, that it can get really difficult, but it can also feel wonderful to just be heard and listened to for the first time. And it's all about you. You can talk about whatever you want. You can take control of the session as far as, these are the things I want to cover. It's collaborative. You can talk to your therapist if it's going in a direction you don't want it to go. Bring it back to where you want it to go, because like you said, don't feel guilty. I mean, that's our job. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not feeling insulted by you saying anything. It's not my therapy, it's yours. And you're paying me, so it's okay to talk about that as a client or as a patient. So I do want people to feel comfortable about that, and make the most of their sessions.
Giving that feedback, right, or the honest feedback of, hey, you said this thing to me and it hurt my feelings, right? I hear that a lot. I'm very directive with the clients that I work with, whether they're the C-suite or these tier 1 military. I work with Delta and Rangers and you name it, right? They want to be told. They don't want me to say, oh, well, so tell me how that makes you feel. That therapy is great. I like that therapy for me. I want my therapist to say, tell me how that made you feel, because I will talk for an hour about how that made me feel, right? But I have other clients who they want to know exactly what I think. And so there are times where that honest vulnerability of me being vulnerable, saying, this is what I think, and them being vulnerable, saying, that hurt my feelings, or I didn't like that, or I don't want to talk about that. Sometimes that's the magic of therapy. That's the therapy, is we get to go back and forth with really difficult conversations. And next week, guess what? I show up again and I say it's amnesty. I show up, no judgment. I'm not holding on to something that we talked about weeks ago. There's no grudge. It's not personal. And we start all over again. And that dance of vulnerability is so important to work through the trauma parts. We have to be able to be vulnerable with each other if we're going to be able to work on the trauma. And so I have to show up and be a real person. I can't hide behind a clipboard because it'll never work then. And so, it's such a good point that you make.
But also, the relationship is so important. It's probably going to be one of the most intimate, vulnerable relationships we're going to have. And so making sure you choose somebody you feel comfortable with and that you feel comfortable being that open and trusting with, and to be able to have that deep conversation with, is so important. And for that reason, keep interviewing until you feel comfortable finding somebody, and then continue to hold on to that relationship and work through your stuff if you found somebody that you feel good with.
Yeah, and therapy doesn't have to be multiple times a week, and some therapists don't necessarily, depending on what modality of therapy they do, don't even see you once a week, and that's okay. And there's some times where I have clients that I've seen for years where I'll see them weekly, and then I see them once a quarter, and it just depends on where they're at in their life and what they need.
It's like when I get acupuncture treatments, I go in for my tune-ups. I don't necessarily have to go every week. I might do it initially for a while, back to back, until I feel better. And then once I feel better, I'll go in for a tune-up every a couple of months. And the same with therapy. Like you, we have patients that see us regularly for a while, and then they no longer need us, and then they'll call in and set up an appointment every couple of months, and then it's not a regular thing. So there's different options of taking advantage of therapy and making the most of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this was a wonderful conversation. Tell us where people can find you and how people can reach you if they have questions, and if you're on social media, where people can follow you.
Yeah, so it's my name, and so you can Google my name and find my website. My email is Joelle and then my name, joellemaletis.com. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Insta. And then we have a lot of different things that we do as a clinic, and we have all sorts of podcasts. You can find me on TED. I'm the author of the TED PTSD video. And so you can find me in all different places, and people are welcome to send me an email, and I will respond. I promise I'll respond and ask questions if you got them.
Well, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation. I think trauma is something we should talk about more often and normalize, and there's no need to suffer. There's lots of support out there. There's lots of different modalities, and if one doesn't work for you, try another. But thank you for being here and having that discussion with me today.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you bringing awareness to it. It's my passion, and I'm glad to share it with you.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.